Welcome to the U-Turn Podcast. This is the place to connect to who you truly are. We're bringing PhDs, experts, and leaders to help you elevate your mindset in your work life and in your love life so that you can see things differently and truly love your world. I'm Ashley Stahl. I'm a career expert, author, and TEDx speechwriter and booker, and I'm excited to bring you in to this week's episode. U-Turn friends, it's Ashley here, and you know that I bring people that I meet in everyday life, people that are friends, people that are experts. Today is Jon Levy. He is someone that I've learned a lot from just watching. He's a behavioral scientist, New York Times bestselling author known for his work in trust, human connection, belonging, influence, and he's taken a lot of his latest research to really help the ways that companies approach marketing, sales, consumer engagement, culture. He has a newborn baby, most importantly.
She's so cute. Oh my God.
Cute. And he has clients across the board, right? Everything from Microsoft, Google, startups. And he has some
I think they're impressed enough. I don't think they need like more of this stuff. If we want, what we could do that'll be really fun is that people always say, Jon, what's a behavioral scientist? And
that's actually my first question.
So, fantastic.
Yeah.
I brought an actual example that I think will be fantastic for you. Now, I know you're all probably listening to this podcast. My hunch is you're probably on your phones. Ashley, do you have your phone next to you?
I do, but I didn't just a few minutes ago.
Okay. Can you put it face down? And all the listeners, you too, put your phones face down. And people always ask me, okay, Jon, explain what a behavioral scientist does. And it works like this. Ashley, without looking at your phone, can you tell me what the app is on the bottom right corner of your screen?
No.
I want you to think about this. You look at your phone 50 to 100 times a day.
Yeah.
And you can't tell me. Now, listeners, you might know, you might not. Everybody quickly take a look. Just open it up. Look at that app on the bottom right corner. You too, Ashley. And then close your phone and put it face down as fast as possible.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, listeners, were you right or were you wrong? About half of the people tell the truth and they say that they were wrong, kind of like Ashley's. I don't know. And about half of you will lie and be like, no, I totally got it right. And the funny thing is, that wasn't even the real question. The real question is, close your eyes. What was the time that was just displayed on your phone? Yeah, you have no idea. You can open your eyes.
You have no idea.
And the reason isn't a flaw in your brains. The reason is actually that's the design of the brain. It's called inattentional blindness. Our brains will only ever focus on what we tell them to look for. So now when I instructed you to look for the app on the bottom right corner of your screen, you completely ignored the lock screen and the time like you were told to. And so the brain is really good at filtering everything out, because if we paid attention to everything, we'd just be overwhelmed.
Right.
And so my job as a behavioral scientist is to figure out all those things that we filtered out. Some of those things are things that we think work really, really, really well. And we keep doing them, but it turns out they're stopping us from succeeding. And some of those things, if we were aware of them, would make us significantly more effective. And the stuff I care about is how we connect with people, how we build trust, how we create meaningful relationships, how we lead our teams or build them, how we work with others, kind of that stuff that's in between people. So I hope you like the example.
Yeah, and I know that you host some dinner experiences amongst people. And
oh, yeah.
You did an experiment like this around teamwork. And you taught the group that we played a little game together. And you showed us how playing games create a sense of community and connection. And it was, you're so brilliant at showing your work, showing the purpose of your work through
Thank you.
Different exercises. I know you're working on your third book right now.
Yeah.
And I want to understand what drives you to write a book, because I got my book deal, I wrote my book, and I felt like I had no words left in me to say after I wrote that book. So I'm really impressed by people who are like, oh, I'm on to my next one. I'm like, are we just, I'm so impressed by all these friends of mine that seem to be able to just have words flying out of them left, right, and center. It's very impressive to me. So I want to understand like why this book now and why the other books you've written. What was it about your work that drove you to write these?
So let's start off with what's the purpose of having a book?
Yeah.
Because in most cases, 280 give or take pages is a terrible way to share an idea. Right? It's just awful. And you want evidence for that? Ashley, we're on Zoom right now recording in audio format.
Yeah.
I'm willing to bet the number of hours of listened audio versus the number of read, digital or print, don't come anywhere near each other. 3 pages of writing is a terrible way to communicate just about anything.
Mm-hmm.
So if we really are honest with ourselves, what are the reasons that you write a book? Well, reason number 1 is you're an accountant that specializes in accounting for plumbers.
Mm.
Now, you're writing a book so that when a plumber Googles, you'll be the only one that shows up and you get a ton of business from it. The book could be the most awful thing ever, but just the fact that you have it means that you've thought more about it than the next people and are thereby the expert that they probably want to speak to. And so it becomes a business development tool.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't need to be published by a major publisher or anything wrong.
Mm.
Reason number 2 is you literally can't help yourself. The number of people who tell me, oh, I've written 500 pages and I need to pare it down or maybe do 2 books. And I'm like, buddy, I've had conversations with you. You aren't that interesting. I know you think your life is interesting. It really isn't. You want an interesting life? Go talk to Malala. When you're shot by the Taliban, then you got a book.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? That is a person who has a need to put something down, a need to process their life. And I'm all for it, but then don't expect anybody to read it.
Mm.
I'm in the category of people. So the third category is it's a platform, meaning I'm a personality. I write a book. It's part of the collection of check marks, right? It's, oh, I've given a TED talk. I've written a book, right? That all of them come together as a bunch of characteristics that say, I'm an expert on this.
Right.
Thereby hire me to do something else. When a person like Adam Grant writes a book, or maybe not Esther Perel, but like in that vein, you end up with a very densely packed collection of thought leadership that then they get to go around and say, hey, don't you want me to talk to your people about this? And then the way that they actually make their money is the speaking, right?
Yeah.
Or TV show or whatever, who knows what, right? Personality, appearances, all that. So when you actually look at it, there's no money to be made in books versus the talk. Somebody who has $100,000 advance on their book probably gets $25,000 to $50,000 a talk. So it's completely disproportionate.
Mm-hmm.
But it gives you a platform to talk about something. And it forces you to organize your thinking so when it comes time to give a talk on the topic, you're actually ready.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in my case, I'm both in group 2 and group 3. I just can't help myself. Most people, a lot of people in my situation would just give their stuff to a ghostwriter. But I can't help myself because I'm a science geek. And what I want to do is take really weird science and combine it with a story so that you never forget it. And so that when you're in a situation, you go, that's what's going on. I finally get it. They're trying to screw with me by doing this. And then it won't affect you in the same way.
Mm.
Once I've revealed it, you can't pretend like it hasn't been revealed. And that's my objective. I can't help myself because I think it's too amusing. Mm. And then I get to do books, publish them, promote them, and get speaking gigs and talk to people about these things I find wildly amusing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's once you see it, you can't unsee it. That reminds me of how Eckhart Tolle talks about awakening. It's a very powerful thing that we realize in our human experience is how, you know what, I want to argue with you about that too, because I think even though you can't unsee it, a lot of people spend their whole life trying not to see what they know.
So what you're talking about is willful blindness.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a few things about willful blindness that are kind of classic. So the first is, when your income is dependent on not seeing the thing, you won't see the thing, right?
Yeah.
If your entire livelihood, yes, there's a fundamental characteristic of human beings that willful blindness is built into us.
Yeah.
The person that doesn't want to see their spouse is cheating and their kids look literally nothing like them, right? Or the person who votes for a politician who's clearly stealing from the people or something like that. But once you're like double down on something, it's really hard to go back, right?
Yeah.
Or the cult member, whatever you want to call
Right. Right. Okay. So I love what you said about books. I've never heard somebody talk about that. One thing in that same vein, by the way, for everybody listening, that I've heard somebody say that really feels like it's in the energy field of what you're sharing is from a life coach named Steve Chandler. He's an incredibly talented coach. And he once talked about how he thinks legacy is kind of bullshit. So the fact that I'm writing a bunch of TEDx talks and a lot of people are doing it as legacy work is not lost on me that I'm talking about this. But I do feel like there is something around legacy just being this ego play where it is nice to want to make the world better. I guess who decides what better means, but do some form of good in your own psyche of what good means. But I think a lot of people are really focused on legacy. And the reality is, Steve Chandler talking about how this is just you wanting to feel important with your life. When really we're, could be seen as like just a bunch of ants walking around a tiny little dot in the galaxy.
Yeah. I'm 100% sure I'm going to be forgotten.
Yeah.
That's okay. Like, I'm totally fine with that.
So with that feeling, how do you make sense of all these books and, you can't help yourself, which is really funny that you said that, but how do you make sense of being a new father, of doing all these things and these existential questions, especially when you're hosting these dinners and that I've been to and all these people are doing really big things in the world?
Just to give the listeners some context, I host about 100 events a year. So I think the events that you came to are called Inspired Culture. It's one of my favorite series that I run. We have about 60 to 80 people come, right? And we surprise you with 3 speakers and you have no idea who it's going to be. And we sometimes play a game. And so we've done one, it'll be like Bill Nye the Science Guy speaking. We'll have one of the Roots perform, and then we'll play like a crazy game to bond people. And then at the next one, we might have an astronaut and we'll play 19 questions to figure out who's at the front of the room. And it turns out it's like Monica Lewinsky, right?
Yeah.
And that's really like one of my big favorite experiences that I run. I probably run like 20 of them a year. And it's all about community and bringing interesting people together and then sharing ideas that will hopefully have a impact. And you ask, I think a great question is like, how do I consider that in the face of this like ephemeral life?
Yeah.
And I think, so what if it's ephemeral? So what if people don't know who I am? I measure my impact by the amount of relationships that I'm able to foster between people. So if we really look at the things that are important to people, like the fundamental elements, well, the greatest predictor of you living a long time is not a kale cleanse and a workout. Number 2 is strong social ties. And number 1 is something called social integration, the number of people you come in contact with.
Can you unpack some of those for people who are really looking to have more fulfillment, feel more longevity? Like, how do they make sense of those 3 different pieces?
Sure. Most of the stuff that people like, I'm a biohacker, blah, blah, blah. The biohacking movement has kind of had to accept that most of that stuff is probably like a 1 to 3% improvement on longevity. That might change with, AI and CRISPR and like all these other things. We might see a sudden breakthrough in longevity. But when you really look, like when you follow the studies, on the low end, the predictors are like clean air and water, right? Sure,
Yeah.
It makes sense that if you're not poisoning yourself, you're going to live longer. Then you have getting your flu shot, especially when you're older, because the older you get, the more susceptible you are. Exercise. And then a big impact is quitting drinking. The second is not the second, but the next one, is quitting smoking. It has a huge impact. And then Mm. The next one up is having strong social ties, so close friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
And number one is this idea of social integration. Basically, are you part of a community, or do you talk to your dry cleaner? Do you talk to the checkout person? Do you actually have contact and feel like you have social interactions?
Yeah, I love that so much. And it's funny. I think that we live in an interesting community, you and I, John, of really amazing people, but also people who are always on an airplane. Like people talk about EMFs and all these like wellness things that I'm not very well acclimated or understand.
EMFs, electromagnetic fields.
Yeah. Yeah. Like they talk about, turn off the Wi-Fi at night when you're sleeping or whatever the things are that are EMFs that are influencing their wellness, or let me get a blanket that blocks the EMFs. I don't even know. I'm just talking about the wellness, I want to say for lack of better term, trends.
Yeah.
And I was reading about it briefly because I was just trying to understand what are these things. And I read that the people who are most exposed are ones that are on airplanes a lot. And I was thinking about how all my friends have these blankets and they're trying to protect themselves from it, but they go on airplanes more than anybody I know.
Yep.
And so there's this paradox that
mostly bullshit. Like if we just want to call it something, it's, you end up with these billionaires isolating themselves, trying to extend their life through weird injections, but then have no social circles. And so they're great. You've extended your life on one side, knocked it down a few pegs on the other, and you're freaking lonely, so you're depressed. Good for you. Yeah. I don't know what to tell you. And then what? You're going to turn yourself into some AI version of yourself so that you could live on, as if, one, you are such a gift to humanity that we have to have you, or B, like, let's be, I'm going to be really honest about something. And this is going to sound very strange. It is very healthy for a society that the older people pass away.
Yeah.
And the reason I say that is not because I'm some demented weirdo. I'm probably that too. But the real reason is that if we never change our leadership out, then what we are is stuck with the way that the thinking people were born into. And so society wouldn't change if leadership didn't change.
Yeah.
And we need a healthy influx of new ideas, new thinking, and new talent at the top to push society forward.
Mm.
And so it's healthy. And so if all of these like business leaders just replace themselves with an AI version of themselves that lives on forever, it really will stagnate our society.
Mm. Mm. Okay, a couple thoughts on that. Well, I want to talk about building trust. You gave this list and the importance of community and all the weird things we're doing to live longer when it really isn't the 80-20 value that we're trying to get out of it. We're trying to squeeze and get the most juice out of life.
Yeah.
And so it seems like community is the thing. But I think
it is absolutely the thing.
Yes. And I fully agree. I value community like you do. It's been the epicenter of my life. And it has been what keeps my soul excited to get up at night, or in the morning, excited to go to bed at night and look forward to things. I know a lot of people get stuck in work. We are working, and we get stuck in like survival and making sure we're providing for our family while we also get to have these social connections. And so many people are in burnout, right? It's like they spend the week trying to survive in this world. And then by the time they get to the weekend and it's community time, they're spent. And so there's got to be some sort of tipping point there. So I wanted to ask you about, number one, just building trust with people. How do you actually form real community? And number two, burnout. So whichever topic is pulling on you more.
Actually, you just asked me to kind of like describe 3 of the most difficult concepts.
Yep.
One right after another in 2 questions.
Yep.
So let's try and tackle.
John, get your helmet. Like, this is me.
Let's tackle this one step at a time.
Yeah.
Okay. The first is, what is trust? And what builds trust is oddly simple if we ask the question about what trust is. Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable. So if I trust you, it simply means that there's a certain level to which I'm willing to be vulnerable. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I will not be able to survive alone in nature. So either I go out alone and die, or I have a willingness to be vulnerable and we work together.
Mm.
people think that what will cause you, Ashley, to trust me is me taking you out for an expensive business dinner and trying to impress you. So at some point, somebody tried to take you out and was like, I know you don't really like my personality, but I've got Taylor Swift tickets. What do you say? And then the person thinks, oh, because I spent a bunch of money, that entitles me to something, like your interest, right?
Yep.
And trust.
Yeah.
And you're like, sorry, buddy, that's not how this works.
Yeah.
And that's because you can't really buy trust.
Yeah.
Trust is a byproduct of something, a few things. One thing is called the IKEA effect. We care more about the things we invest effort into, like our IKEA furniture. When we assemble it, we care more about it.
Mm.
So if we want to trust each other, we should invest effort into something together.
Mm.
That's why I play so many games with groups, because that shared effort triggers a response of trust. The second thing is, and this is really important, we believe that trust precedes vulnerability, and it doesn't. Trust is the willingness to be vulnerable. I must be willing to be vulnerable before trust can exist.
Mm.
So if I 6 months ago call you up, Ashley, and I go, oh my God, Q3 has been an absolute train wreck. Businesses are like really limiting their spending. I'm kind of freaking out. If I said that to you, in that moment, I've signaled trust. Now, if you go, oh, John, I have no clue what you're talking about. It sounds like you're just failing because my, earnings are way up. Then trust will be reduced because I was vulnerable and it was punished.
Mm-hmm.
But if you acknowledge it and go, John, I totally get it. And then you signal vulnerability back. I've been there. I remember when I was doing at one of my companies, whatever it was, and things just were not coming in and I was freaking out. The moment that I see that you've signaled vulnerability to the same level, trust increases to that higher level. So person one signals, person two acknowledges, person two signals, person one acknowledges, trust increases to that higher level. That is what trust is made out of. It is the most basic unit of trust. It's called a vulnerability loop. And everything is a vulnerability loop. When I say everything, I mean, I drop some papers, you help me pick them up, open, close. I lean in to make a joke in a meeting. Vulnerability, you laughing, close.
Mm.
I hand you change. Have you ever passed somebody your credit card or change
Yeah.
And there's this weird bounce that you do?
Yeah.
Right? Like you pass it to them and then they bounce it back.
Yeah.
It's because that's the acceptance and the signal of you can let go.
Mm.
All of these things are minute or micro vulnerability loops. And as they stack one on top of the other, we learn to trust people more and more and more. It's also why, have you ever been in a situation where you totally overshared?
Yes. Oh my God. Like vulnerability hangover galore.
Yes. That's because your vulnerability signal wasn't matched in return.
Mm-hmm.
And so if it's undermatched, you feel like you overshared.
Right. So is it not about you? It's about how you got related to. When the feeling of overshared, you would argue from a research.
Yes, precisely.
Not that you actually did. It's how you were met in the sharing.
Precisely.
That's right.
And I want to say that sometimes it's just inappropriate to share things. So don't be surprised if you share something that's not appropriate.
Yeah.
And people don't respond. If you're like, oh, me and my spouse were getting a divorce. And you're like, I'm just standing here at the bus stop. I don't know why you're talking to me. That's not a surprising response.
Yeah, totally. It's interesting listening to you talk about this because I feel like, Brene Brown talks about this. She calls it drive-by vulnerability, which I totally get. It's like just sharing something that the relationship isn't prepared to hold. The relationship hasn't made sense to hold, or the context. But there's a lot of little things I think people can do when they're building community, build trust. And one thing I've personally experienced is just initiating. That's such a vulnerable thing to do that is underrated, is just initiating the plan, saying, hey, let's get together. I think a lot of people don't actually hold the reservation time and say, hey, I'm making a reservation. Are you available to come? Including people, inviting people to experience that they wouldn't have otherwise made it to. I have made so many deep friendships on the basis of people who moved to Los Angeles, didn't know anyone. And all I had to do was ask an event host if one more person can come and invite that person. And it created this much deeper, much more appreciated, lasting bond. So are there some low-hanging fruit things that you think people can do in their relationships right now outside of getting to know the names of the guy at the front desk at the gym, the barista, like all that stuff, when it comes to actually initiating relationships and building community?
So the name of my book is called You're Invited. And the reason is that it's for that very reason that you just described. It's that an invitation has a unique role in our social structure.
Yeah.
And it's that when I put out an invitation, I give you the opportunity to say I'm all in on something. And then somebody goes from invited to being committed to something.
Mm-hmm.
And it has the potential of drastically impacting and growing relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, we don't have enough people gathering. We are in the midst of a loneliness epidemic that is just out of control.
Mm-hmm.
More people are dying lonely deaths than I think we've ever had in history. And a lonely death is when somebody passes away and nobody finds them for months because they're so disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
It was originally reported, I believe, in Korea because people would be dying in their homes and eventually social services would discover that they were passed.
Yeah, wow.
And I think that an invitation is absolutely critical. And giving people belonging cues is kind of one of those fundamental elements of being human, right? Is that our biggest punishment for people in our society is telling them they don't belong. It's putting them in prison, putting them in solitary confinement, or sending them out of the country, right, to live somewhere, I don't even know where, right? And that's saying, hey, you are not a functional member of our society. We don't want you around.
Yeah.
Traditionally, kicking somebody out of the village meant that they would die if you had to fend for yourself. And so for human beings, having a feeling of belonging is absolutely critical.
Yeah. Okay, so I know there's a lot of things that people can do simply right now to really impact their ability to connect. And you've shared some of these things. Is there something that...
The most important by far is if you go on to Amazon, there's a book called You're Invited by Jon Levy. I hear he's pretty awesome and really smart. What you do is you click the link to it, and then you buy 100 to 500 copies for you and your closest friends. You throw a party and you get together. And I think that should cure all loneliness everywhere. And according to all the biohackers, improve your jumping height and your heart rate variability and all those really important health markers.
I love that so much. Okay, the final thing I want to ask you about before we go is burnout, because I've seen you, Jon, and I know that you're probably navigating this as a new father and a business owner and an author and all these identities that we step into.
Mm-hmm.
And people are burnt out, and nothing is worse than trying to connect when you feel dead inside and you got nothing left to give and you're exhausted. And so I want to talk a little bit about just what have you learned to be true about burnout, and how can people start to maybe get to know themselves better as it relates to burnout to stay nourished and be able to maintain these connections that we're encouraging them to build.
So burnout, first of all, wasn't even something that was recognized till recent history. It's a really tough one because burnout is often caused have you ever been on a hike and there's a pebble in your shoe?
Yeah. I feel like sometimes in my life there's a pebble in my shoe.
So it keeps wearing at you. And then at a certain point, you're just not able to walk anymore. You're just trudging away, barely surviving. And that's kind of like burnout. It's the things that kind of suck your energy little bit by little bit. Any one of them by themselves isn't kind of enough. But when you stack it all up with the circumstance that you have to keep walking, you end up in a situation where you're like zombified. And so burnout has a very specific definition. Taking a vacation doesn't solve it. Because then when you come back, that you might get to take your boots off to go to the beach for a week. But when you come back and put those boots back on, that pebble's still in there.
Right.
So burnout is a systemic issue. It's a combination of expectations from the boss and social expectations on women versus men. And what are the annoyances at work that just shouldn't exist? Like, why am I spending 6 hours filling out forms that some AI could do in 3 seconds? Right? All these things are what lead to burnout. That also, and for us entrepreneurs, there's this element of hustle culture where our entire life identity has been combined with our work. Ashley, if you aren't giving 14 TEDx talks and at the same time writing a book and doing a thing and so on and so forth, you end up in a situation where you're working all the time and you forget why you're doing it.
Yes.
And you feel disconnected and you don't have the social connections to decrease the pressure on you.
Yeah. Yeah. What do you think? I guess this could be my final question is, what do you think outside of the obvious, right? Being a bad friend, meaning not doing what you say you're going to do, or just like integrity, being out of integrity, lying, whatever these things are.
Mm.
What do you think causes people to lose friends?
Oh, that's an easy one.
Yeah. Tell me.
That's the easiest question you could ask me.
Good.
Would you like to take a guess? Because I actually have an answer, like a real answer.
Being fake and being tiring to listen to? I don't know, like not knowing yourself?
There's no self to know. Let's start off with that. That's not how the brain works. There's no like authentic self. It just literally doesn't exist. That's kind of a pile of crap that was fed to us by new age personal gurus and has no basis in science whatsoever.
Whatsoever. The realness here.
Anytime anybody says, oh, that's the authentic me or something like that, it is the dumbest pile of hooey you could imagine, and you can feel free to skip listening to their next sentence. The researchers had people sit around a table and measure each other on their authenticity. The number you gave yourself would not match the numbers everybody else gave you. Right?
Wow. Yeah, I believe that research. I've seen that. Yeah.
Hold on. There's one additional thing. None of the numbers they gave you match each other. And the reason is that authenticity isn't a thing. Works. The brain evolved all these weird sections that are constantly fighting for dominance. And depending on how hungry you are, time of day, the way you were raised, if somebody was mean to you, you are either a really wonderful person or a really terrible person or something in between. And it has nothing to do with some pure version of yourself that's inside there called the authentic self. It does not exist. What we've discovered is that we call something authentic when it acts consistently with the narrative that we have of it. A parent might say, oh, she's really authentic. She loves sports, blah, blah, blah. And you're having fun playing sports. And then you're around the cool kids in high school and you're like, screw sports, let's go get high. And they'll assume that that's your authentic self because you're acting consistent with the narrative that they have of you in each scenario. But there is no authentic self. Our personalities change multiple times in an hour. To answer your first question, what causes people to lose friends? Moving. The moment you move, you lose almost all of your social ties. Yeah. Relationships are most frequently built on proximity. And that's that.
What an obvious, but not so obvious thought. Like people just think, oh, I'm going to pick up and move, but they don't realize like you're getting rid of one of the most important aspects of your longevity while you do it. What about making new ties? Does that create any sort of surge?
I think that is a much more complex question best suited for the next time we chat.
You are welcome to come on anytime. You are full of information. Remind us where we can go get your book, how we can best support your work and learn more to grow our connections.
Ooh, support my work. Send money.
Venmo, Jon.
Yes. The answer, you can find me at jonlevy.com, Jon, there's no H, L-E, V as in Victor, Y as in yellow, Jon Levy, jonlevy.com. And I'm probably most active on LinkedIn, but it's Jon Levy TLB everywhere. T like Thomas, L like lion, B like boy. And then my book is called, my most recent book is called You're Invited. That one was the fancy New York Times bestseller and Wall Street Journal bestseller and all that. And you can find that anywhere. There are books. It's Amazon. I don't know. Do people go to Barnes and Nobles? Maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. It still exists. It's still happening.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
So yeah, check it out. Buy a copy or 200. Let me know what you think.
Thank you again for coming on and taking the time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning into the U-Turn podcast. And thank you again so much for our sponsors. We are here because of you. And to our listeners, thank you for checking out our sponsors. We always pick people and brands that we trust and we believe in. And just for listening to the show, writing your reviews on the Apple app, and just being willing to make your own U-turns. We'll see you next week.